if such there be. I am a Layman Pascal, and welcome to a very special episode of the Integral Meta Podcast. Now, normally I'd tell you that we're interviewing people who are trying to bring forth higher, deeper, more integrated, and more transformative perspectives through podcasting, YouTubery, salons, websites, and other forms of online content. I'd tell you that our project is to find out who these people are, what they're collectively pointing towards, and what we can do to clarify, amplify, and interlink them. But today we're doing something slightly different. We're going to out-meta our meta-ness as I talk to the founder, organizer, and editor of the various Integral Stage series, my pal, Bruce Alderman. Hi, Bruce.
Hey, Layman. Great to see you.
You too, buddy. Why don't you briefly tell people where they can find this online content?
Right now, it's on YouTube, just the Integral Stage channel on YouTube. I am hoping fairly soon, within the next month, to be able to launch a podcast version of all of the episodes here as well, so that people can stream them in different formats. We've gotten a lot of feedback that people would prefer sometimes to be able to just digest this while exercising or doing housework or whatever. So I want to try to help that out.
Why on earth did you start doing it? You're a semi-respected spiritual intellectual and grammatical scholar. What's with the video series?
I like the semi-respected. That's perfect. Yeah. It actually started on a different track. I wasn't imagining what this became. In several forums, especially one particular forum, but several forums, there were different kinds of conflicts and heated things arising. And I wanted to create a space where people could meet face-to-face and talk about some of the more difficult topics, and really have a way to work them through in a different format than in the purely, written form of a, forum discussion, which we know often can go south. And so that was my original plan, was just to create a different place where people could meet and actually work through some of the more difficult and challenging content. But as I started to kind of build it and develop it, I started thinking, if we just jumped in with all of that really heated content, who knows where this is going to go. And I actually became a little bit cautious about jumping in with some of the more controversial stuff right away, and decided open up the lens a little bit and begin to look more, broadly at different topics, and then warm up to possibly bringing in some of the more challenging topics that have, sometimes fractured aspects of our community. And as this developed, I just really I don't remember exactly when it happened, but at some point it just struck me that actually what I've often felt a need for and have been missing is a platform that really can help highlight all of the brilliance that's out there in our community. That there are a lot of people in a lot of different areas of work and practice who have a lot to say, and who maybe share posts here and there on Facebook, but me knowing them, I knew that there's actually a lot more there that doesn't necessarily get highlighted. And I wanted maybe an alternative, not a competitor, because there's too much of a difference in scope and everything to Integral Life, but an alternative where there's more of a grassroots kind of focus and more of a look at what's going on in the field among people who are experimenting and practicing in these general integral-ish meta-modern domains.
So how do you feel about our current level of controversial material? Are we a little lower, a little higher, or right on from where you'd like it to be? If you were thinking about controversy initially, are we not being controversial enough, or have we gotten to the kind of content you were initially imagining it could have? Or how do you feel about that?
We haven't gotten there yet. And I really thought if it just started off with that, it's going to become a very, very different thing. And my life isn't defined by that kind of controversy. And there's a lot that I value in my life besides, the heated fractions within the integral community. And so I just wanted to move in a direction that was more, I would say, nurturing of the overall spirit that I feel is emerging in multiple areas than just going for the CNN conflict zone where everybody's like battling in little boxes, on the screen. So as I said, I held back from that. I think we can go farther. I think there are things going on in the culture at large right now, with both the deep suspiciousness that's emerged among, I think, even significant quarters of the integral community of our government, of our institutions, of globally what's going on, of our news and information sources. There's a deep suspicion there, which I think in some aspects is healthy and maybe some aspects is corrosive. And so that's an area that I'd like to explore eventually. And also, the whole issue around race and justice and injustice in this country, the culture wars. So there are different areas there that I think we could move into more. I just haven't wanted to rush into that without actually laying some groundwork where we have a sense of who we are before we dive into what's dividing people.
Very sensible. I like the kind of balance that we've struck so far, which is to say, on the one hand, you've got talks from and interviews with people who are pretty well known, prominent or respected spiritual teachers, thinkers, authors. But on the other hand, you've got people who are not just grassroots, but maybe confrontational, or who hold a really strong version of the higher perspective against a bunch of other versions that they want to constantly challenge. Right? If you lean too far into the respected authors, so to speak, you end up with kind of a standardized thing that becomes a little bit dull over time and doesn't represent either the community or the world that the community is doing sense making for. But on the other hand, if you lean too heavy into just letting everybody have their voice, then it kind of risks degenerating, losing credibility. And like you say, it can overwhelm the opportunity that a project needs in order to find its own voice. And I think you saw that in Earpiece Saloon, right? So maybe you could speak a little bit about that, because in a way, that's the precursor to this. That was you as a host for a scenario in which a lot of perspectives would get put forward and could try to work themselves out. And you wanted to leave it really open to allow controversial perspectives. But, did that get away from you? Are you happy with how that went? What was your idea in setting that space up, as a precursor to these kinds of online projects?
Right. Yeah, I think that is really an important dimension of this. And I almost feel haunted by Earpiece Saloon. I've started, I've run other forums for many years, and I think the Integral Post-Metaphysical Spirituality Forum has been pretty dynamic and successful over the years, though it is definitely quieter now, and often, I admit, is only a place where I advertise my integral stage videos now, compared to what I used to do and contribute to that, that space. But yes, Earpiece Saloon, of course, I've recounted this elsewhere. It started initially as a joke and was not intended to be an actual functioning place. But once I saw it was taking off, I wanted it to be a place that was open, without the normal kind of social constraints in place that, that maybe cause people to hold back or be fake or artificial in their communication, or fearful to explore topics that are a little bit more edgy and controversial. And so I wanted to give space for that, since it often got shut down in other places, or at least led to, again, some intractable seeming conflicts. And also I've said, I feel like I almost shouldn't say it out loud, but in one sense, I wanted Earpiece to be a place where some of the more controversial voices that were experienced as disrupting all the other forums could gather and do their thing, right? And maybe relieve some of the other forums of so much of that heat, and have a place where these perspectives could have a voice, and have a chance to work through what they were seeing and wanting to make sense of. So that was the overall project with Therapy Saloon. And I think there were some beautiful and successful moments in there where people felt freer to be more authentic, and therefore they actually reduced their contentiousness because there wasn't that edge to push against, and there's more of a trust that formed among people. That, at least the feedback I've gotten from members, is that they actually formed what they felt were closer relations with people than they had in other integral forum contexts. So that part was a success. But overall, I did feel allowing and actually kind of highlighting and focusing on the controversial and the cheeky and the irreverent almost as too much of a central theme, plus making a space myself as the host for views that were not my own, but that I was giving them a platform to work themselves out. I did find eventually that it got away from me and became kind of a headache for me, in that I was trying to moderate and modulate kind of the intensity of what was building there, knowing that it's going to be reflecting back on me as my thing in my space. And so, yeah, I think what you've said before is really sensible and true, that in launching the integral stage, I needed to lay a firmer ground before some of that stuff is invited in.
I don't know how long we've been doing this now, somewhere between 9 and 12 months, maybe. We've done a lot of conversations with people, and we've had a lot of people put forth their ideas in sort of little collections on various themes. What stands out to you? Whose talks or interviews do you remember? What sort of lingers with you? What do you find interesting? What did you think was a really good instance of the integral stage?
Although the UFO theme is not central or very important to me, I'm curious, I'm interested. Those were a lot of fun. I really enjoyed those conversations, and I really liked your and my exploration of what good is God talk. I feel that version of it that's out there now is production-wise amateurish, and I'd like to go back and do it. But I liked that exploration and some of our early experiments with format, in terms of like us both trying to argue the position. So I liked those things, but actually I think what's standing out to me now, many of them are your interviews. I really appreciate what you've brought to the integral stage, both the Fire from Heaven conversations and these podcaster conversations are, for me, opening up a lot of really interesting perspectives and territory, and are very personal, but also, I think, are able to bring forward depths of perspectives that are engaging. So I think, valued overall what you've brought to the stage in terms of your interview series. I think you were wise in early on noting that I'm less skilled in the interview area and that you might sit in and do some of that, take over some of that for me. And I launched this project by myself, and you were available very early on and just interested and engaged, and really have offered a lot of your time. So I just want to say thank you, really thank you for everything you've brought. And for you, what has really stood out for you in the content? I'd like to turn that back.
All right, this is where he becomes the interviewer. I'll tell you, one of the things I've really liked about it is the chance to expose people in the community to other people in the community who they might be peripherally aware of, but you don't have time to get into everybody. And if you just see their tweets or their Facebook posts, you get a certain feeling of who they are, which is often very limiting and doesn't allow you to appreciate the insights that are underneath their expressions, right? So it's not that I think the content was great, but I really appreciated doing that talk with Frank Visser early on, just because I think he holds a perspective that people normally have to either agree with or attack. And that's very appropriate in a way when you're only reading Facebook posts. But when you have an hour and a half to hear somebody, if you put the time in, you get a lot more nuanced take on what they're doing. But which ones have I really liked? I really enjoyed talking to Daniel Thorson last month. I'm keen to talk to him again. I felt like our takes on some of the basic Buddhist concepts are very similar, and that there's a lot more energy and niceness of spirit to unpack there. I have enjoyed doing these podcasts once because it sort of struck me for a long time, and I think I suggested it a few times before we got started, like why do we lean so much into author lecturers when maybe the real action is migrating to other media forms already? And of course, the Fire from Heaven one was great. It was nice to be able to talk to really smart or really interesting or really experienced people in terms of high-level spiritual transmission, which is something I've always been personally obsessed by and engaged with.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Those were, really great conversations. And I think you said exactly what I was thinking as well, in terms of being able to help us know each other more and know people in the community more. Because I think, from my mostly back channel contact with people, though sometimes through the forums, I've really come to appreciate, the richness of the lives and the work that these people are doing. But again, as you say, are often only peripherally known. And I think it's really, to me, that's a good value that this channel can provide, is to surface those things and to help us, I think, become more intimate with each other as a community, and also to expand the boundaries of what we consider integral community as we're venturing into metamodern and game B and other kinds of spaces.
I think it's a great format for getting a sense of what's really going on in the community, because there's things like, if I were to only talk to older, spiritually aware, socially concerned, intellectually sophisticated people, I would get the sense that a guy like Brent Cooper is just a problematic gadfly of some kind, right? But when I talked in the first Integral Podcasting interview to Stephanie, and I said, well, who do you like? And she's like, Brent Cooper. I'm like, what? Nobody ever says anything good about that guy. But it turns out there's a bunch of people, younger, progressive in their politics, attuned to the medium, who really resonate with that kind of stuff. And you wouldn't get the sense that there's a bunch of people that are in on that if you just sort of scanned books and articles and Facebook posts and things like that. So in order to get a read of the topology of the community's attitudes, this is a really important medium, because I don't think that comes out in other ways. You don't get it from a book. You don't get it from a post. You get it from spending some time with somebody going over a bunch of elements of the terrain that they're experiencing. But what's the opposite of what you like? Like in terms of doing all this, what's the biggest hassle for you?
Probably editing, as anyone would expect. I think one of the things that's a challenge for me is just juggling the time. I'm already notoriously busy with several jobs, and this takes a lot of time to do and produce this content. So it's always a struggle to be able to do it, though I think maybe these days people won't notice that, because we've been able to put out a lot of content pretty regularly, and I'm happy for that. But it's taking a lot of work in the background. I think as I'm getting better at editing, it's becoming less of a headache for me. I think probably one of the things that's most frustrating is something that lies outside of our control to some degree, and that is just technology in terms of our connections. For instance, I have a really nice talk that's about to come out for the Future Faces of Spirit, but it really got distorted through poor audio connection and video lags and almost destroyed it. And if the person I did this with could actually redo it, that would be great, but they don't have enough time. So I'm working, a lot to try to salvage that, because the content is really very interesting and I think people will enjoy it. But that's a kind of a deeper frustrating part of this, is just the nature of this medium is different. If you want to write something and put it out there, the words are just there. But here we're more dependent on the contingencies of network connection and people having the right equipment. Your talk with Frank was a great talk, but it almost was destroyed by the audio quality. So that's a frustrating part, and I'm hoping maybe figure out things on my end, technically and professionally, that we can lessen the occurrence of those kinds of things.
Yeah, for me, that definitely, feeling that something might get sabotaged by the audio or by an internet connection lag on the other side of the world, that's a bit frustrating. Worrying that you're working too hard gets to me. Or if I'm talking to somebody and the kids go by upstairs and it creaks the floor and the audio tracks to me, and then I'm like, like securing the right space. Getting the lighting. I'm just constantly experimenting with lighting, and I'm satisfied with none of it. I don't really want to invest in professional lighting equipment, but I do want to be a little bit better than my light bulb.
Exactly. Hey, put your clothes on.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, same. I'm wanting to slowly build up better equipment and set up better spaces. But I think that gets to something that came up in one of your earlier podcast talks, that what's the aesthetic we're going for here? And I think, I think you offered a nice take on that. So I'd just like to ask you, what's your ideal balance?
Well, it's interesting because you're going for it's got to work, right? I mean, it means the audio's got to be there. The recording's got to operate. You've got to be able to get it and transmit it and cut it up as you like. So as long as you got all that stuff there, then I think you're going for something that's a little bit ragged, right? It's got to feel a little bit amateurish, because you do want to feel like you're in somebody's life, that you're getting to know them, and that they're either being authentic or having a good time. And part of that is that they have a world outside of the screen. And one of the really limiting things in a way about, I say, film and television, or even about professional presentations in general, has been that they carefully control what's in the box that you're looking at. Mm-hmm. And the sense that there's a tangle of life just outside the screen, I think, is a really important piece of the podcasting medium. It's a little grungier. It's a little more open to off screen. It's a little happier with happenstance. Obviously you can't hear the sound for a whole interview. It sucks. But if there's a few minutes of sound confusion and the people have to talk about the sound problem, I kind of like that. You know what I mean? Like because you're in it with them and they're addressing it, and it's okay if you have to make a little effort to pay attention. And that's what it's like to listen to these things too. Like I got to go on my phone and switch from YouTube to the desktop version of YouTube so that I can play it in the background and put my headphones on and do the yard work. And I'm going to get too far from the Wi-Fi and it's going to gap out for a minute or something. Like there's all this sort of tattered quality at the edges, which I don't think is a failure of the old aesthetic. I think it's the emergence of the new. And I think maybe I was talking to Jeremy Johnson about this, with the sense that it's become too easy to package things nicely. And I think I mentioned about, maybe I did, maybe I didn't, this old idea that, in the 1700s, farmers had to work in the fields. So you were sophisticated if you were pale, right? But in 1950, everybody was in the office. So you were sophisticated if you had a tan. right? So it's always playing off what exists. And you get to the point now in the 21st century where, screen fixes and makeup and cosmetic surgery and helpers, like, it's not hard to look good anymore. It's so easy in a way that looking like you don't care about looking good is the new looking good to some degree, right?
Lucky for me. I think there's something about our particular time right now with the lockdown and the pandemics and everybody being actually cut off from the ordinary tangle of encounters with people where there are interruptions and ambient noises, and there's a whole world spinning around you. And a lot of us now are more confined to our homes, and forced to be face to face on screen if we're going to be meeting many people. And so I think that that addition of the raggedness actually helps us feel more enworlded with people. Not some taste of still being in the mix of life with people instead of just confined to these mediated electronic spaces.
I would say that sort of represents the culture starting to catch up with where the avant-garde has been for 80 years already, in terms of, even what was cool in the 40s, 50s, and 60s was already that kind of James Dean Brando thing where it was going off the rails, was followed up by that Nicholson thing of like getting a little bit more textured, getting a little bit more earthy, a little bit more worldly, right? Focusing on texture and complexity and authenticity and mutuality instead of one-way transmission, packaging, and marketing perfection. So I think that at least my favorite artists and thinkers have been on this kind of wave since at least the early mid 20th century.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, I think, of the people who I show up, in some way that was part of the Earpies shtick, even though I don't want to carry that spirit too much forward into the integral stage, but that was part of the shtick of Earpies as well, was to show up and let it hang out and just be more raw and less refined, less packaged and presented. I think there's wonderful things to say, only let your best self show up in the forum. And so this was deliberately asking you not to show up in any packaged way, or any idealized, cultivated way, but just to be there. So I think, although we're not highlighting some of the juvenile humor and such in this in this particular platform, there is something of that spirit, I think, carrying forward in what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, it speaks to me about the archaic revival and, a kind of deep ecology as well, because I think you want to feel like your feet are on dirt. I think you want to feel like you're in the jungle a little bit. That means things are going to buzz. Something's going to bite you once in a while, but it's going to be lush. It's going to be fascinating things around every corner. There's going to be strange flowers. Some of them you definitely don't want to get close to, but it's interesting to see from a distance. Other ones have these amazing aromas, but that kind of world, the sort of recovery of the virtues of the pre-civilized without losing the virtues of modernity, I think that's where we're going forward towards. And in terms of writing the course of the civilization, it's not just about making changes to industry and policy so that we can get into a better situation with the future of the environment that we all depend on. It's also about incorporating the cognitive styles and aesthetic styles that exist in the wilderness, bringing those a little closer to the civilized ethos.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it puts me in mind of a Vietnamese author who described, how he wrote novels. And he talked about the different ways that you can enter a forest. And, some people will go there with a purpose to find something. And I'm going after, this sight or this experience. And if they move in too forcefully, they're actually going to cause the forest to retreat from them. And there's a kind of posture that's necessary when you enter the wild to allow what is there to come forward. There's a posture of listening. There's a posture of respect and silence. I think there's an allowance of openness around the edges of your attention and experience. So I wanted to ask you, in your experience of talking with people, and a number of people have commented to you that they feel that you are a good interviewer. What for you are the qualities of deep listening that maybe bring in something of that wilderness eco-aesthetic that I was just mentioning, or if there's any connection there, but just what for you are the qualities of listening, and maybe even we could look at what are the levels or the stages of listening?
Good question, but I hesitate up front because I want to navigate my own response to a lifetime of people suggesting that listening is an ideal quality. I feel like I have to be a little bit cautious about that. Like, you can't throw a rock without hitting someone who's like, he's great because he gives you all his attention. He's a good listener. You know, he's not just waiting for his turn to speak. Right? That's cliche at this point. So you want to make sure you're not getting caught into an idealistic notion of listening. I think that's, for me, that's the first step, so that I'm just available to face the problem. First of all, I know that there's a place to get to, right? First time you and I met in person was at the Integral Meta Theory Conference in 2015. And I'd sort of come there in a way to find out if these are my people, was my question to myself. And I left and I thought there were just so many great conversations. There was such a, if you could get to it, such a beautiful spirit of mutuality and sense making that you just really feel spiritually converted. You think this is the future. It's not in anybody's theory. It's in this community if its interactions operate correctly. So knowing that, right, like there's a sort of navigating blind if you know where you're trying to get to, which is that feeling. So that, I think that's the first part, is you're not just impersonally applying a strategy of listening. You're actually trying to get somewhere that you want to go, that you know is enlivening to your own heart and hopefully useful to the world. On top of that, I think the main quality of a good listener is curiosity, because it's not so much about listening. I mean, you do have to let people talk, and in some ways as much as they want, but in other ways you got to cut them off. In some ways you have to be a bad listener to be a good listener. So you're always negotiating that and guessing it and feeling that you got it wrong. But if you hear something they say and you think of something you actually want to know about, then you are attentive, and then you know the next question, and it's a question whose answer you want to hear, so then you listen. To me, that's the main quality, other than just being relaxed and being attentive to tempo, like you're dancing a little bit, and not prejudging it, like you don't care how it turns out exactly. You just sort of want it to follow its pattern. If it's a little bit too excessive, you wiggle it a little bit. But those are all very basic skills. For me, that the main things are authentic curiosity and a notion of the feeling quality that I want to get to in any conversation.
Great. Yeah. I'm thinking about, the name of this platform, the Integral Stage, and playing on meanings there, of course. One is a stage where we present performances of a kind, of interviews and discussions and art and whatever else we might do. And then the other is to look at the Integral Stage as a way of being together, a way of making meaning, a way of, sense making and perceiving and cognizing and feeling and integrating, that we want to feel out, where is that happening in the culture, not necessarily under the package of, a sold, paradigm, right? It's definitely going to be there, and we want to highlight what's going on in our recognized community, but also to feel out where this is showing up broadly in the culture, right? So it means reaching outside of our community, in a sense, to find out where are integral stage things happening, projects that are growing, ways of being together that are manifesting. So in terms of what we've been doing so far, how are we doing with that, do you think? Where else could we go?
That's a really good question. And, it comes, in my mind, it gives me the image of trying to connect a community that only half understands that it's a community and currently exists under these different umbrellas. Right? So when I talk about integral or integrative, what I mean is, 60% of the people who are integral and 58% of the people who are metamodernists and 40% of the game B people and 30% of the Gurdjieffians, and like it's all over. It's parts of these things all over. And how do they find each other? And so one of the things is we're going to have to reach a little further in terms of finding people that we want to talk to and weaving them in. Like right now, they all have this sort of, even in the title, the idea of integral theory with sort of Ken Wilber at the side. It constrains a lot of people's thinking, and not necessarily in a bad way. It gives them a coordination point. But I know I talk to people and they'll mention integral theory or Ken Wilber, and they do this thing where they gesture at me as if they're sort of they've gone out of their way to mention it to me because I stand for it. And that's fine. I don't mind standing for it, but I see that it's in their mind as like this bright object. And I'd like to reach out further into the darker space of people that have no idea about any of this stuff. But if you got them talking, the patterns that they see and are trying to embody would be obviously those same patterns. I don't exactly know how to do that. I mean, now that you say it, I can think of a few possible examples where I would like to go with it. But I think it naturally expands if you just keep talking to people, because they're always suggesting other people, and different people are getting interested because of those people. I think we have a good momentum going at the moment if we stick to it. At the same time, I'd like to ask you this, like, who's your fantasy interview? I mean, I know we did Jorge Ferrer. I know that's a big one for you, but who else would you love to talk to?
I actually think this is way beyond our scope as far as I can tell. I'd really like to talk to some of the people who've been influences on my thinking recently, in terms of some of the formation of my ideas around post-metaphysics and metaphysics, around what's emerging culturally. So I think it would be great to talk to people like Peter Sloterdijk or Bruno Latour, people like that have been an influence on me. I really would like to probably talk with some of the people that are current right now. Like we had a good chance to talk to Vervaeke, and I really enjoyed your interactions with him, and to have Vervaeke on the integral stage. But I think some of the voices like Daniel Schmachtenberger or Charles Eisenstein, I think those are some interesting voices that I'd really like to bring in here. I think the whole area of polydox theology, particularly like with Katherine Keller. I'd love for us to have a chance to talk with Katherine Keller, both for her, I think really amazing insights into, integrative theology, and for her what theology means, which is really a way to ask the kinds of philosophical questions that are not allowed typically in the academy. But it doesn't mean just flying off into groundless metaphysics. But it does mean maybe engaging with questions that often aren't entertained anymore under especially the analytical spell in the philosophy departments and that sort of thing. So yeah, she would be a great person just because of her insights into, I think, some of the hot topics right now around, feminism and diversity and race. But for me, she presents them and folds them into a vision that doesn't seem to run along the tracks that a lot in the integral community are concerned about with excessive policing of thought and that sort of thing. So yeah, she would be an exciting person to have on the stage. I think those are all in the direction of authors and public people, probably in terms of people who are just out there practicing. I don't know. I'd have to think about that, but I think that there are, more people in our community that we can be bringing forward.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I've really enjoyed about this podcast series is a lot of the suggestions for who to talk to are not people I ever would have thought of to talk to, right? We just had that conversation one day, and I started that Facebook group to be a place to compile suggestions, right? And only 2 or 3 of the, I don't know how many dozen or so people I've talked to could I have guessed in advance. So that we need ways of inviting other people to tell us who we should talk to in some regard. Because I think if we lean into our own predispositions, we're going to end up having hopefully some really good conversations with some really good authors on evolving post-metaphysical spiritual topics, which is important. We absolutely want those, but we need people to lean into their own predispositions and let us know who we should be talking to next.
Exactly. Yeah, I really feel that too. And I've been grateful for, the suggestions made so far and people seeing what we're doing and then stepping forward themselves, Ralph Cree and others who've come forward, and I didn't even know about them, but was really delighted to discover them. Just, so sometimes I've complained about the loneliness of this medium, especially for me, where I'm more on, my role has become more on just doing the work of producing it and putting it out. But there feels from my side like less of a immediate one-on-one engagement with people that I used to have in the forums. So I feel like there's something valuable and worthwhile in doing this and putting forward content that's going to be preserved and digestible in a way that people will want to engage with. But there's been a little bit of, on my side, loneliness because you don't see that much feedback about what you put out, and a lot of conversation actually doesn't result from the videos. People might thumbs up it or make a couple of comments, but it doesn't really generate further discussion. So that's a part that I've been feeling is like a hole for me in terms of what I'd like to be getting out of the overall experience. But the reason I'm mentioning that is that sometimes what we're doing is rippling out and touching people that we don't even know are there, and then they come, to us, and it's an opportunity to get to know people and to hear perspectives that we wouldn't have discovered. So that's been an unexpected gift.
On the one hand, I feel like we should do more of the kinds of interviews we did with Jorge, where sort of you and I can be there together and trade off a little bit, where it's somebody that you're excited to talk to. But on the other hand, I was just thinking about this week, I'm doing my second interview with the Discord app group that's formed around Vervaeke's Awakening to the Meaning Crisis videos and to the people that he's interviewed. So I got invited on there as somebody that he talks to, and I did a little audio interview. I'm going to do another one. But they've formed a little community of people who want to talk about that whole set of videos and content. So that might be a way to go, is you could sort of deliberately set up a little community. I mean, they've got this guy, Brett, and these guys who are running it for him. He's not doing all the work himself. But there's a cluster that's specifically contextualized around the idea of discussing content that they've seen in that video series. That might be a way to go.
That's great. Yeah. I thought possibly, the integral stage Facebook group could serve that purpose, and it isn't really yet, but it would be nice to gather some people in a maybe in a more interactive environment like Discord, or Zoom, conversations, that sort of thing. And there is something I'm planning, that will be, I think, more interactive and engaging, following out of the Future Faces of Spirit series, and it hopefully can maybe turn into something that will be relatively regular. We can't do it a lot, but and that is, I want to organize maybe a 1 or 2 day event where there will be different people gathering from the series and have a chance for live conversation and meeting and interaction with the different people. So it's going to be a bit of a scheduling challenge, and I'm working on that. But that's what I'd like, is to, sometimes out of our series, is to organize events of some kind where people can come together. It doesn't have to be recorded. It could be recorded, but as a way for us to further go into material and to meet and to connect.
Yes, myself and the other people who've proposed versions of the future of spirituality and religion are going to fight each other on stage to see who was correct. Live and interactive. That's great. I look forward to those projects moving forward, and I'm looking forward to participating and assisting in them. I have a question, and I'm pretty sure I know what your answer is going to be, but it's around the way that conversation and mutuality are becoming important in people's minds. Because when we got this started, you and I did some talks. I did a couple interviews, but mostly I was providing content videos for the different themes you were presenting. And that involved me working out my ideas and writing them out and doing a bit of a performance into the camera. But as I started seeing that your time was consumed and that there were things I might bring to the conversational interview format, I started to do that, and it sort of took over, right? So that's 85% of my focus now. I do almost no writing, just I'm going to make myself struggle to do writing projects, because there's something about this engagement that feels good. And there's also a philosophy about why this mutual sense making might be absolutely what's required, certainly in this historical moment, but maybe always as a process senior to that of the individual thinker. And I wonder if you experience that, and if you're sensing from other people that they would kind of rather have a talk with someone rather than just express their ideas at people.
Yes. Yeah. I've regularly gotten the feedback when we've been putting together some of these different Wheel of Perspectives videos, where typically somebody will give a statement, and then the second round will be the room for the dialogue. But, with Jorge and with Greg Henriquez recently and several other people, typically when I invite them, their first response is, I'd rather have a talk about this than just to stand there and present something. And I think there's sense on both sides of that and value on both sides of that. After Greg Henriquez went ahead and did his presentation, he was grateful for it. He said, actually, that forced me to gather, a number of my perspectives that I had not put all in one place, and to really present them in a coherent way. And so he was grateful for the challenge and the opportunity of doing that. And so I think there's value in it, especially if we're going to follow up with a round of conversation. But overall, I agree. I think our ability to communicate and to sense make together, and what Bohm is after in his Bohmian dialogue, in terms of us being able to actually enter a circle, suspend our commitment to our own thought enough that we can offer the content into the between and see what can emerge. That whole art of learning to come to collective insight together, which doesn't mean necessarily agreement, but to come to collective insight together and to share meaning together, to learn the art of calling meaning from the depths and discovering new meaning. I think that's a vastly underappreciated or undercultivated art in our time. Ironically, in the age of easy communication and lots of media content, we've in some sense lost the art of the parlor conversation, or the coffee coffee shop conversation, salon, that kind of thing. So I think that really actually needs to come forward again, and people are hungry for it. Years ago, and it's interesting because some people will know David Long, and he's interested in doing an integral news project. But many years ago, I found myself, watching and digesting different forms of media, and really dissatisfied with the depth of the encounters that were demonstrated on most media outlets that were mainstream. They were shallow, they were rehearsed, they were just aiming at the heat, and there wasn't sense making that could actually constructively build culture going on. And so I think having a space to practice that and to enact that is increasingly valuable, especially as Schmachtenberger and others are pointing out, we're having such, and Vervaeke, we're having such a meaning crisis, and that there's such pollution in our information ecologies. We need more than ever to learn how to make sense and share meaning in these times and in these spaces.
Yeah, the complexity of the world situation and the ambiguity of the mass situations we face, and the uncertainty of what information means in a hypersemantic environment where you're bombarded by potentially significant, potentially dubious signals at a rate that's just so much beyond what any of our ancestors were evolved to face, puts us in a really tricky position. We can't use a lot of our old methods for sense making, and we can't take action without having done some sense making. Mm-hmm. So how do we do a form of sense making that allows us to upgrade fast enough, but in the right way, to get on board with whatever kind of shared spirit and collective vision we need in order to make the world a sustainable and satisfying place where meaning is intensified? So obviously you've got to do it in this sort of node network situation where people who are tuned into that, have a little bit of that skill, can come together with each other and sort of reflect their ideas back and forth to each other, refining them and trying to see what emerges out of that. But in order to do that, you have to not only hold a space for it and provide the actual circumstance, but bracket out a lot of stuff that might otherwise get in there. You were talking about, your experience of media in the past and how unsatisfying it was. When I was a kid, I used to just jump from one news service to another, right? I had this idea that I couldn't trust anybody's own news, right? I could listen to Al Jazeera about the United States and listen to United States news about England and listen to the BBC about Canada, but never trust any country's news about itself. So I did that for a long time. And then I thought, I'm not getting anything from this. In fact, I'm absorbing more data and understanding less. I started to watch a lot of Charlie Rose because that was available at the time, like younger Charlie Rose. And what I admired about him was he would phrase the question in a way that already took all of the normal topics off the table, right? Most of the answers you would give to an interviewer, he would sum up in his question. And so they said, I already know this, and I already know this, and I already know this. So take all that off the table. What else do you feel about this? Then there was a beautiful pattern in there. And I think that's something I'd like to be able to do more, is really, say to the other person, listen, I and we get all this stuff already. This is the normal stuff you say. You'd say this, you'd say this, you'd say this. Great, we love it. But what else would you say? What would you say fresh? What would you say right now? What can we say together in this moment that's going to give us some new shared sense that we didn't know coming in?
That's great. Yeah. Really pushing each other to the edge of the known. Again, since I just did a video with Krishnamurti, highlighted in that one of the last Future Faces of Spirit episodes with Krishnamurti, but he's always talking about, freedom from the known. And while you're not talking about that exactly, that you're talking about freedom at the edges of the known, in a sense. And so that relates, I think, to a sense of what we're doing as a kind of practice, as well as a kind of service. I feel, that there's both going on. I wanted to ask you, for yourself, in since you've become involved in doing, producing this kind of content over the last year, how does this show up in relationship to, we might say, your own integral life practice? Like, what is doing this work in relationship to your practice life? Is it a form of practice? Is it a form of expressing the fruits of your practice? Or how would you put it?
It's both. I mean, it obviously expresses what I am and where I'm at right now. And it's based on all of my intuitions over the whole of my life in terms of how people should relate, where I should be thinking, what I should be asking questions about in the world, that kind of stuff. But it is absolutely a part of the mandala of my practice life, for sure. And it has useful consequences in the rest of my life. Like it helps me value the mutuality and mutual discovery of conversation in every other area of my life as well. In terms of the recent shutdown of civilization, so to speak, it's an essential way for me to connect with the people I want to connect with. But that's not just because of COVID. It's because 90% of the people I really need to talk to do not live on my block. They live in other countries. So that's essential. And I think, I'll come back to the practice element a little bit, but it's a need. For me, it's a need, right? And I think that there's a lot of people who, if they were honest with themselves or tried to take an inventory of what their needs are at different levels, right? A lot of people, well, just breathing and eating. Well, then other people go, oh, well, my sex life, or all these kind of things. Yes, but also your deep conversation life. I think once you see into that, it is a real need, and you need a lot of it, or you need however much you need with whatever regularity you need. And so trying to be upfront with yourself about that and considering that it's a real form of nourishment for you is important, because practice has these two aspects. One is you've got to be stabilized. And the other is you got to try to move forward. So in order to stabilize yourself, you need all the kinds of qualitative nourishment that you need in whatever amount and frequency you actually need them. And the other is it allowing you to perform an intentional practice that you think is moving you to your next degree of being, or whatever that means. So both of those things. And I think for me, it fills a need. I imagine that it's helpful to the world. So it touches in with that aspect. But it helps me to receive new ideas, to try to be present, to ask myself to be more intersubjectively and mutually, right? I don't always pull it off. Right? At the end of every interview, I go, yeah, that felt great. I feel really nourished, but how could I be twice as good at this as I am right now? I'm only okay in my own evaluation. How can I be more? There's a drive to be more with people. And I don't know all the skills and practices necessary to do that. But what this does is it forces me to ask that question. It gives me the need for that. It gives me the energy to want to do whatever those practices are.
Exactly. Yeah, I have that same sense here, and I felt, in watching you work with other people, that I could see both you're bringing the layman that I have known and the iconosostocles that I have known over many years into that space, just through the way that you're asking questions and bringing maybe undisclosed or implicit meanings forward. in the way that the way that I know in your sense of adjacency to bring things into nearness and to connection. I see you doing that in practice, and I appreciate that. And for me too, I've been reflecting on this, and I'd like to really, it's part of my practice life, but I'd really like to change some dimensions of what I'm doing. Some of what I'm doing is familiar to me. It's like I've been a writer in the past. I've made amateur music and presented that in the past. Now I'm making video projects, but all of them involve kind of solo work that is like crafted and put together and then put out into the world. And I like that work. I like that as a practice, but there's something solitary about it. And I was reflecting, this could be an excuse or me rationalizing things away, but I've noticed in myself something I'm growing into, but there's a disconnect between my verbal, self and my written self. I'm able to express myself in a way in writing that I'm less able to do so smoothly and clearly verbally. And partly I relate that to the contexts that I live in. Since I went to Asia and I lived there for 4 years, I practiced and got into the habit of speaking in telegraphic English in order to be understood in contexts where most people didn't know English very well. And now I've married interculturally, and I actually live in a home where I also still truncate and telegraph my English in order to be clear. And I don't bring up the kinds of conversations that I would want to have because they just would not land anywhere. They couldn't be grasped. So that's 25 years of being in a context where verbally I've been truncating my English in most daily contexts. And so for me, I'm looking at Integral Stage, personally and selfishly as a place for me to warm up and bring together my live and verbal self with my kind of like deeper reflective author self and find a way to better integrate them. There are a few friends that I have who I experience in them as already having integrated those things. Mark Schmenko was a person like that. When I dialogued with him, I found he could speak like he writes. And I feel that you're good at that too. You can speak like you write. And that's where I want to lean, as if I'm looking at this work as a kind of ILP, I'm wanting to lean into that kind of deeper integration of myself through this kind of work.
Myselves. Nice. Yeah, you make me think of, that conference where we first met in person. And I'd come with that talk on what the fuck is meta theory to give. And I was out at this party the previous night with some of the other volunteers who I was hanging out with and complaining that I just didn't have time to give the talk in the time I had. And this wonderful young woman said, "Why don't you just do the Q&A?" And I thought, that's brilliant. That's amazing. I'll just open it to questions right away. Right. And that puts me on the spot. I've got the information because I wrote it and rehearsed it. But now I'm on a scary edge where I don't know if I'm going to be able to say it the way I want to say it. But my hope is by persisting in being at that edge that I get better at that somehow.
Right.
Now, maybe you get better at it, or maybe you just get comfortable not being good at it. I don't know. But I certainly feel a lot more comfortable the more I do this. I feel more, and I have these other things. I got my radio show, and I'm not an absolute novice when it comes to this kind of communication. But certainly putting myself right at that threshold, it feels like it does something for me, and it opens up a zone of communication that increasingly feels more meaningful than what I write. And when you write, you can go over it, you get it right, and when you get a nice sentence, it reflects your essence back to yourself, and you're like, oh, I compressed my notion, it's fantastic. And you don't necessarily get that in person. Because even if you do a good statement, your attention is immediately on the other person and not on evaluating how you've crafted the idea. So you have to, there's a sacrifice there. It opens you up and there's a risk, but it's a very beautiful thing. I think it's very important. And the more I've touched both the world of writing and the world of exchange, the more I favor the world of exchange.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've been deeply concerned with that world of exchange in terms of my own reflection and thought. And there are ways that I've been doing that, but mostly it's been in written form. But yeah, for me, an abiding interest is, because of where I live and how I live, intercultural, contact and communication and bridging of meanings across different topologies, information zone, information topologies or meaning paradigms. That's really important for me and something I've thought a lot about. I know in my own life, the place that I normally put myself on the edge is when I'm teaching, and, I'll prepare for a lecture, but then I actually stand up in front of the room and I don't know exactly what I'm going to say. And I let myself just hover on that edge and fall into it. And sometimes I can surprise myself with what comes out. Not always, sometimes it doesn't, but more often than not, I've been able to be satisfied with what can come out in that space. Sitting in front of a camera is a different thing. And, especially if you're just giving a talk, but at least when we're doing a conversation like this, it feels closer to a face-to-face meaningful dialogical encounter. And I think it's really important that we learn, to dance better in those spaces.
It's
for me,
it's really hard to get the energy when you're just yourself in front of the camera, like contrasting between participating in a wheel of perspectives where I say a position into the camera and chatting with someone. When you're chatting with someone, you have to be really present. There's an energy there. There's a surprise. You don't know what's going to happen. There's all those things. When you're just by yourself recording something, it's a lot of extra work to get that, right? I have to make sure that I have a little performance game in my head, that I've written it out in a way that is going to delight me and surprise me as I go. Otherwise, it would be really kind of dull and sad to just be speaking your ideas into a camera by yourself.
Exactly. There's something pretty unsatisfying about that. It can feel good it's like when you write something and you just like you said, you get the right compression, and editing can help that of the video. You finally get the package, but there's a liveliness there that's missed, that I think we can get in these, mutual exchanges. So taking a meta perspective on the project, and this is a question you can ask me, but I'm asking you, where would you like this to go, in terms of like, what are we doing? What's next for you in working with the integral stage?
Well, we've touched on some of them already. I mean, my fantasy next three things is, one, I get a lot better at what this is, and that doesn't mean professional in the pre-internet way. It means what's the professional version of the new scenario? Like, what skills am I currently embodying, and how could I embody them better, and which ones am I lacking that I actually think are valuable, rather than just assuming people might think they're valuable? How do I do what I'm doing more deeply, more consciously, more intentionally, to the point where I could even say to other people, here's how to do this a little bit better, because I've done this enough that I know how we can get there. If we just tweak it like this, we can get more efficiently to that space that feeds that new energy back and forth to each other, does that sense making, gives us that feeling. I want to get there. I think bringing people together in person is a huge next step. Reaching out to a broader range of people who could be folded in, finding those right ones. But also, I'd love to be able to take it on the road. I don't know what the travel situation of the world is now or will be, but if I could do this in other countries, on the road, in other places, if I could go to people, go to situations, do it that way, have a bit more of an exploration, I think that would be amazing. I think there's a lot of people out there who, even while they would do it in the Zoom formats, that you'd get all this other richness if you went to where they live and saw their life and saw their ecosystem, saw them interact with it a little bit, and got to be like, the next step from just having a really good conversation with someone is sharing a bit of life with someone in the right way.
I have a similar aim, which is, I'd like to have opportunities to bring people together. After the Future Faces of Spirit, I wanted to actually have an in-person gathering of participants, whoever could make it. The pandemic has kind of quashed that idea for right now. And so I'm trying to work out how I can possibly at least arrange a virtual meeting by the end of the summer, maybe, where people can, gather and have a chance to dialogue throughout the day, and be an open platform that people can come onto and experience. But I ultimately would, if things normalize, I would love it where some of the things that we're doing could turn into on-the-ground events, different kinds of symposia or conferences that could be recorded or broadcast live. David Fuller, with what he's doing with Rebel Wisdom, I think is wonderful. And it's really remarkable how they have grown in the last year. They've really exploded, and it's great. And I think, I've watched him go to the different people, just like you were saying, and noticed what a difference that made to actually be there present in the room, and to be able to, share drinks and sit on a couch and enter a different field together, and something else emerges in that space. So I would love it if we could ultimately be able to do something like that, just like you were saying, where we could bring more, of people's lives into what we're producing. I actually, right now we're focusing a lot on verbal content, which is great. And, that's, I think, always going to be the main part of what we're doing. But early on, we did, an integral art exhibit with Jenny Baird's work, which is wonderful. And I'd like to do more of that, where we could showcase other people's creative work, art, one, to talk about art and have a dialogue around art, but also just to have a platform that can showcase that kind of people's creative content. There's an idea that we had on the books that we actually haven't carried out yet, which was enacting a ritual together where people all contributed some kind of performance, play, invocation, practice to a collectively created ritual around, certain themes. And so there's ways that I think that we could use this space that aren't yet tapped. I like the dialogical and the podcasting element of it, and I think that's always going to be the core. But I'd like to, as an integral stage, have a platform to bring in other kinds of content that we can participate together and appreciate each other from multiple channels.
Yeah, those are fantastic projects. I was hoping you'd mention the ritual stuff. And while you were doing that, I thought of, and I don't know if we're exactly the medium for this, but when I've been talking to people lately, there's a real sense of the need to get beyond just people sharing their perspectives, to get to some kind of convergent position, quasi-formally, both in terms of having a nice time with each other and sharing perspectives and getting onto a good intersubjective vibe that seems like it has a little more than the sum of its parts involved. That's really important, but how does that become actionable, right? How do we actually, if these are good conversations going on between interesting people, how do we pool their ideas together and have a look at what that is, right? What's the equivalent of taking a vote in a smart way? that doesn't do a disservice to the mutuality, but says, hey, here is what we all generally think is this. And we could move forward together on that one way or another. I think that's going to be an important piece going forward.
Yes, I think that's great. And one thing that we haven't touched on yet, but what we did a little bit when we talked about bringing in controversial, topics, but the debate format. And we've gotten some pushback from some members of the community that were too agreeable. And even though we've wanted to, I think, bring out content that was not just the representation of the formal integral view, but to be more raw and just see what emerged. And a lot of people have been hungry for something like that. And I think we've been able to do something like that. But some people are saying that we need more debate, where we need to actually have people take a stand, around important topics and work through them and actually, go through the process of winnowing out, views that really don't stand up, and refining, our understanding. And so I think there could be, room for more, debate type encounters where we do this consolidation or consensus building in and through that process. It doesn't only have to be in the debate format, but I think that's one way we could do it. Another is, as we were talking, possibly like after we finish, a Wheel of Perspectives, is to get together again and try to digest, what are the really salient pieces that emerged from the whole, the whole process. What can we draw out of there that we can, we can carry forward. What were the meaningful fruits of that? And
when we were putting together the questions for the UFO roundtable, I think, to me, one of the ones that I suggested that turned out in hindsight to be productive, in my view, was to say to people, what do you think everyone else is saying, and what did you hear that you didn't expect? So that each person gets to step out of their perspective and try to work with the group, and then those meta perspectives can be exchanged. I think that's really useful. The debate format, I think, is a great idea as long as we frame it correctly, right? Because we don't want to just indulge in conflict.
Right.
We don't want anybody to think that they've won. You know what I mean? It's not about figuring out which is the correct. It's about refining it to the point where they can acknowledge what was correct about each of the positions and come to a hybrid statement that includes those validities built into itself. And then we have something collectively that we can go forward together on.
Exactly. Yeah, I think we attempted that, early on, where, I actually, we called it a polarity dialogue, where we both argued for and against something and then tried to synthesize that at the end. And maybe that was a little bit too formal, and we need to allow, at least initially, that back and forth. That's not just conflict for conflict's sake, but nevertheless, the real staking out of positions and commitments and the hard work of navigating those differences, to see what we can arrive at the end. Again, I agree with you 100% that we don't really want the typical, university or high school debate club thing where we're going to decide on, basically who was the winner of that cage match. We can say that, somebody overall gave a better performance or made a better case for their position. I mean, I think that's going to be evident. But I think an integral approach is not going to, be satisfied with just having one guy raise the hand and get the trophy. We want to move beyond that.
It occurred to me that there was something I left out when you asked about the integral stage projects that I remembered or liked the most. The integral Satanism get together was a lot of fun. Partly because it's such a weird polarized topic. It seems like the opposite of what would normally be affirmed I did that slowly stripping my clothes thing and beginning with the mask, so it was fun for me to inhabit that. But at the same time, I kept thinking, like, what am I doing here? Like, why am I in discussion with a bunch of Satanists, right? And so that's fascinating. That's a great spot to be in yourself and to unpack the virtuous insights in a form that initially seems to be their opposite. That's really exciting. It feels really productive to me. And I just had a fun night that night with everybody. So I wanted to mention that. But going on from that, a question I'd like to ask you is, I guess I ask everybody on the podcasting series, what do you listen to? What do you watch? Where do you go online? Other than watching all of the integral stage things, which you have to do. Who do you think, well, this person's really got some great YouTube content or a great podcast, whether that means their content or their style, and you think, oh, that's really good. I'd love to go more in that direction.
I want to second, first of all, the comment about the integral Satanism video. That was in my mind when I was talking, and I meant to actually say that one because that one was a lot of fun for me as well. I loved playing with the faux menacing tone and the irreverence around that and the unexpectedness of it. I thought they're great people. I really like both of them, and I liked being able to go into a topic that people were likely to be afraid of, and to find beauty and value in that space. That was a great exercise, and I'd like to do more like that. So I want to just definitely second that. In terms of content that I digest, I want to say something that is not on the theme of what we do here, and then I'll talk about people who are more on the theme of what we do here. But partly it's just a little bit of a way to have some downtime, but I actually also find it really engaging, and that is I watch a lot of reaction videos on YouTube. I really am delighted by people who are exposing themselves to material that they are not familiar with or that are outside of their comfort zones, and then offering their kind of authentic, raw reactions to what that is. So there's the Fish Out of Water, series, or there's a bunch of different ones that follow along the same thing where they, a hip hop, or a metalhead listens to whatever, and they're exposing themselves to content that they've never encountered before, and letting themselves be moved by it, be surprised by it, sometimes be disgusted or turned off or bored by it, whatever. But I really, some of those programs are fake or staged, and you can usually tell that, but sometimes you really get a sense of just being there in the moment of discovery of something fresh. And those are delightful to me. And I've thought about how could we do, an integral stage reaction video series where we could pick some interesting content and react to it. Just deliberately expose ourselves to something and react to it. Those, get a lot of attention, YouTube time, and they're a lot of fun and they're engaging. And for me, they're mind candy. But sometimes I've been moved to tears by some people's reaction to material that touched them in a way that they didn't expect, and so I think it's actually a pretty fun medium, and I'd like to explore how we could do something like that. But in terms of, the content that I listen to, I don't have a lot of time to digest things that I'm not reading hardly anymore. If I can, I listen to some audiobooks, but I don't have much time for that. I really would love, actually, without cursing myself or jinxing myself, I'd love a year to get back into digesting stuff that matters to me outside of the busyness that I always have. But when I do have a chance to listen to something, these days it's been Joe Rogan or Rebel Wisdom or the Emerge podcast. Those three have really been interesting for me, and they don't come from the same ideological spaces. I don't inhabit really the same I'm probably most closely aligned with what's going on the Emerge podcast in terms of my own worldview and sensibilities. But the depth and the relevance and the liveliness and the freshness of what I encounter on Joe Rogan's podcast or on a number of the Rebel Wisdom series, those impress me, and they inspire me in terms of what I want to try to get up to here in terms of the level of quality and the reach for relevant and deep sense making.
Okay. Well, we must be getting near the end. Is there anything we haven't talked about that we should?
You're lagging a little bit. Would you mind just saying that one again?
I think we're getting near the end. But is there anything we haven't covered that we should? How's that?
That's great. That's great. See, now I'm not going to edit out the lagging. I'll leave this all in here. I think we've covered good ground. Main thing I wanted to really look at was, where we've been and where we're going and what we value in the midst of what we're doing. I've still been trying to feel around for the appropriate tagline for our channel, and I told you one of them is, showcasing culture's emerging edge. And I don't know, there's something that feels a little bit grandiose about it, that I think you need something like that. And at the same time, I want to be cautious about it. But to me, that's exciting. I do want to see what's emerging. I think there's a lot of sense that the way that we've been doing things is no longer adequate to the world condition, and that we really are pressed up against our limits and needing to find new ways of encountering the world and each other and making sense of it, and navigating the hyper complexity and the ambiguity of our information ecologies. So yeah, I think I don't want to say culture's leading edge. Maybe that's a little bit of a green concern, but I do want to say, culture's emerging edge, in terms of not all of it is going to be ultimately valuable, or it's not going to stand the test of time. But I think the whole range of experimentation that's happening at the edges of our culture, it's important to look at. Not all of it is going to be leading and actually carrying us forward, but all of it, I think, is interesting to look at and important. So that's an aspiration for me, is to really be attuned to what's happening as people are basically moving into those liminal spaces and trying to see, what's next. I think we're between paradigms, ultimately, cultural paradigms, and it's a frothy and interesting space.
Yeah, I think it's important to at least bathe in the aesthetic of what's emerging a little bit, so that you can feel intuitively connected to what's going on. Because otherwise, very good, sensible ideas that are out of touch with what's growing at the edges of the culture, they could be extremely destructive, or they could miss the moment, or they could have a fabulously good notion that no longer applies, things like that. So it's important to really have clear thoughts and a solid being. But at the same time, you have to be open to edges of emergence that are things that you might even hope aren't emerging. Even just if you can get their flavor without prejudging them too much, then I think that'll feed into your intuition about where we need to go and how we need to handle things.
Exactly.
I'm hoping that people continue to suggest to us who we should talk to. I hope that we continue to grow organically, but add in a little of the new style of professionalism that we're hoping for, and get these sort of extra integral stage projects underway. And beyond that, I'm just having a fabulous time doing it. And I love you, and I love doing things with you, as always.
Same here. You're a great friend and a brother. Love you too. Yeah, so thanks for this time.
Cheers.
Cheers. Take care.